Imagine being prescribed a strict medical diet.
Okay.
And this diet consists exclusively of baby food for an entire year.
Oh, wow.
Right. And it's not because you have like a degenerative stomach disease and you haven't lost your teeth. It's actually because you're suffering from a severe panic disorder.
That is just, I mean, that's wild.
It is, but your doctors, they don't even know what a panic attack is, so they just assume your terror has to be a bleeding ulcer.
Right, because the medical vocabulary just wasn't there yet.
Exactly. So today we're taking a deep dive into this raw, completely unflinching set of oral history transcripts from April 1994.
Yeah, these are fascinating.
They really are. They capture the life stories of two people, Ralph and Helen Belotti, just entirely in their own words. And, if you've ever pictured the early 20th century immigrant experience as this sort of sepia-tone romantic journey.
Where they look at the Statue of Liberty and just instantly thrive.
Yeah, exactly. Like they just roll up their sleeves and everything is great. Well, this deep dive is going to shatter that glass completely.
It absolutely dismantles that myth. What we have here, it isn't a neat linear story of the American dream.
Yeah.
I mean, it is a microscopic look at pure survival.
Survival against just unbelievable odds.
Right. These transcripts offer this incredibly rare window into how massive historical forces like the Great Depression, the rise of Mussolini, the New Deal, didn't just affect economies.
They affected individuals on a biological level.
Yes. They actively cascaded down to just, crush and mold and entirely reshape the nervous systems of two very real people.
And our mission for you today is to look past that sanitized version of history. We want to understand the actual mechanics of that survival.
Which means looking at profound, untreated trauma.
Right. The frankly terrifying reality of 1930s medical care and the sheer grit it took just to keep a family breathing.
It's heavy, but it's so important.
It is. So to understand how Ralph's psychological defenses eventually just collapsed in America, I think we have to start with this wild geographic whiplash he experienced as a young kid.
Oh, the reverse migration.
Yeah. I was reading this and I actually had to double-check the dates. Because he was born in Kenosha, Wisconsin in 1914. But he doesn't stay there.
No, he doesn't. In 1920, when Ralph is just 6 years old, his family packs up and moves back to Italy.
Which, that has to feel like being shoved into a time machine.
Totally.
He goes from a bustling American city where he vividly remembers being terrified of these, early futuristic cars roaring down 57th Street to a month-long transatlantic boat ride.
And on this boat, he's just this tiny kid hiding on the very tip of the ship's bow.
Yeah, he tells the interviewer he had, quote, no fear dangling over the ocean, at least until an adult physically yanked him back.
But then they land in Naples, and the environmental shock is just profound.
That's like stepping back centuries.
Exactly. They take a train to this remote junction, and from there, the terrain becomes so rugged they literally have to tie 6-year-old Ralph to a mule with ropes.
Just so he won't fall off into a ravine.
Right. They are traversing steep mountains and rivers and these clay roads in the dead of night just to reach this cliffside agricultural town called Rocca Bernarda.
And the living conditions when they get there are basically medieval. They move a family of 8 into a 2-room stone house.
With no running water?
No water, no electricity, no heat. He even mentions that the chickens slept on a stepladder inside the house that led up to the attic.
It's so visceral.
And the town itself operates on this brutal, pragmatic logic. There's this one deeply disturbing memory Ralph shares about a town ordinance, about loose dogs.
Yeah, the stray animal issue on the cliffs.
Right. Apparently there were too many loose dogs and pigs roaming around. So a group of local men with rifles simply lined up a flock of stray dogs on a cliff edge and shot them.
Right in front of the neighborhood kids.
Exactly. Ralph explicitly remembers seeing their heads coming apart. And you have to wonder, how does a child's brain even process that kind of normalized violence?
Well, it does it by entirely rewiring what it means to feel safe.
Wow.
Because in that environment, survival isn't about emotional security.
Right.
It's about utility.
Right. What can you produce?
Exactly. Now, the Belotti family owned land, which was technically a privilege in rural Italy, but it demanded unceasing, brutal labor just to yield enough food to survive.
So everyone had to work.
Everyone. By the time Ralph is 8 or 9 years old, he's waking up at 4 a.m. to feed mules. He's shoving bread and sausage into his pocket to eat while riding out to the fields in the dark, and he's working until the sun goes down.
And his father was incredibly strict about this, right? If Ralph was caught playing instead of working, he was severely punished.
Because play was a luxury that could literally lead to starvation.
That is just so heavy for a kid.
It is. But the mechanism we really need to pay attention to here is how this shapes Ralph's identity. For a child in that environment, you learn very quickly that your fundamental human value is entirely dictated by your capacity for extreme physical labor.
And your ability to endure hardship in total silence.
Exactly. That ingrained association between work, pain, and worth, that sets the psychological baseline for everything that happens to him later.
Okay, so if Ralph's baseline is waking up at 4 a.m. to feed mules in a medieval cliff town, what forces him to leave that environment? Because he clearly adapts to the harshness.
It's the threat of something even worse. Fast forward to 1929. Mussolini is consolidating power,
Ah, right.
and a draft is looming for the impending war in Ethiopia. Ralph is 15 years old. To avoid becoming cannon fodder, his family realizes they have a loophole.
His U.S. birthright citizenship.
Exactly. They use it to send him back to America.
Which sounds like an escape hatch, but the timing is almost unbelievably tragic. He gets sent back just as the Great Depression is tearing the United States apart.
The worst possible time.
Right, and the journey itself is miserable. He's on a ship called the Conte Biancomano. He's sharing this tiny, cramped cabin with a total stranger, sleeping head to toe.
Oh, and he specifically remembers the inescapable smell of the other kid's feet.
Yes. And he is so violently seasick, he can't even touch the rationed wine they were given.
So he arrives at the train depot in Chicago, right? He's a 15-year-old kid who doesn't speak a single word of English.
Completely alone.
And a depot worker physically pins tags to his chest, basically processing him like a piece of lost luggage, and puts him on a train heading north to Kenosha.
Wait, let me get this straight. He arrives in Kenosha, and the plan is for him to stay with family, right? You would assume this is where the safety net finally catches him.
You would assume that, yes.
But instead, his own uncle, Uncle Peorio, takes this non-English speaking teenager into his home and immediately demands $25 a week for rent.
For a room heated by a single floor grate.
In 1929, during the collapse of the global economy, how is a teenager supposed to generate that kind of cash?
He can't. Not without being entirely exploited. $25 a week was an astronomical sum then.
It's basically extortion.
Exactly. And the psychological mechanism at play here is betrayal. The family structure, which is supposed to be the ultimate refuge for an immigrant, instantly becomes transactional.
Wow.
It forces Ralph into immediate grueling farm labor in the summers for just $1 a day, solely to pay off a debt to his own blood relative.
So he ends up living with these host families while working the fields, and reading his memories of living with a Norwegian farmer's family, the emotional isolation just leaps off the page.
It's heartbreaking.
It really is. He notes that the family silently viewed him as a, quote, dago immigrant. During their family dinners, the silence was so oppressive and his shame was so deep that he never once asked for seconds.
He tells the interviewer he would leave the table ravenously hungry every single night.
Yeah, he felt like he could eat an entire loaf of bread by himself, but instead he just went up to his room to be hungry in the dark.
Just think about the last time you felt truly alone in a new city or a new job.
Now strip away your ability to speak the language.
And your bank account, and any guarantee of your next meal. That kind of prolonged isolation is a specific, insidious type of trauma. We often conceptualize trauma as a singular violent event like a car crash or an attack.
Right.
But chronic unsafety and the total absence of emotional support during your formative developmental years fundamentally alters your nervous system.
He was in constant fight or flight.
Yes. Ralph is carrying the weight of the worst economic crisis in U.S. history entirely on his own shoulders. And the fragility of his situation is exposed when that Norwegian farmer, after losing his money in the stock market crash, shoots himself in the head.
Just a horrific outcome, and suddenly Ralph is jobless, traumatized by the suicide of his employer, and forced back to the uncle who is still demanding rent money.
It's relentless.
It really is. So how does he break out of this cycle?
By pure luck, honestly, and a New Deal program. In 1934, he's hanging around the local YMCA when the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, needs to fill a quota.
And he gets in.
He gets in. He's sent to camps in Fort Sheridan, Coon Valley, and Long Lake to plant trees and build dams.
So the CCC essentially functions as an exoskeleton for him. Like, his internal life is chaos, but the military-style discipline of the camp provides an external structure that forces him to stay upright.
Precisely. Structure is incredibly grounding for someone whose entire existence has been dictated by the whims of others and economic collapse.
Right. Suddenly he knows what to expect.
Yes. The CCC gave him 3 meals a day, a rigid schedule, and a clear purpose.
It even gives him the space to start defending his own dignity. There's this incident where a guy keeps calling him a slur at the mess hall. Ralph finally snaps, grabs the guy, and physically pounds his head into the floor.
Yeah, he didn't hold back.
No. And as punishment, the camp commanders force Ralph to eat outside from a mess kit for 3 days. But you can tell from the transcript he didn't care. He had finally drawn a boundary.
He even gets promoted to a squad leader after that.
But just as he's stabilizing, we get this visceral, horrifying accident.
Right. In 1935, his squad is making fence posts. Ralph is holding a wooden post steady, and a fellow worker is swinging an axe to sharpen the end. The worker's axe misses the wood entirely, grazes past the post, and strikes Ralph directly in the face, shattering 2 bones above and below his right eye.
Just brutal. And Ralph's description of the impact is chilling. He says, quote, "Everything inside went in a corner."
It's such a specific, accurate way to describe traumatic shock.
It really is. So what does 1930s medicine actually do for a traumatic brain and facial injury?
Well, it highlights the severe limitations of the era's neurology. He is sent to an army hospital in Chicago. To test his neurological state and vision, the doctors put him in a chair overlooking the city, spin him around at incredibly high speeds, and abruptly stop the chair to observe how his eyes track.
That sounds like a carnival ride, not a medical diagnostic.
It was incredibly primitive, and when they finally conclude that his vision is permanently altered and they can't fix the bone structure with surgery, they simply discharge him.
They just send him home.
They send him home.
Which sets the stage for the massive crisis of 1938. By 1937, Ralph meets a young woman named Helen. They fall in love, and things actually seem to be moving toward a happy ending.
Finally, right?
Right. On Christmas Eve, he gives her an engagement ring. But immediately after taking that step, his entire physical and mental system completely collapses. He suffers what was called a nervous breakdown.
And we're talking severe physical symptoms.
Yeah, like 105-degree fevers, terrifying panic attacks, and running down the hallways screaming. He describes feeling entirely, quote, lost. Why does he break down right then when he's finally stable and in love?
It's a circuit breaker analogy.
Okay, explain that.
For his entire life, Ralph had been pushing far too much voltage through his nervous system. Childhood abuse, starvation, transnational dislocation, chronic isolation, and finally, severe physical head trauma.
That's a lot of voltage.
Exactly. The engagement ring wasn't a tragedy. It was just the final appliance plugged into the wall. The prospect of taking on the responsibility of a wife and a future was the final stressor. His system overloaded, and the circuit breaker tripped, shutting the entire grid down to prevent a fire.
And this brings us back to the baby food from the intro. So they essentially locked a traumatized, panicking man in a hospital room because they thought his fear was a biological infection.
Yes, because the medical establishment of the 1930s lacked the vocabulary for psychosomatic illness. They didn't understand that psychological terror could manifest as a 105-degree fever or crippling stomach pain.
Right.
Because he complained of agonizing stomach cramps, which is a common symptom of severe anxiety. Doctors assumed his stomach lining was failing.
So they put him in an isolation hospital, subjected him to a painful spinal tap, and fed this grown man a diet of only baby food for an entire year to treat an ulcer he never had.
It's tragic, honestly.
It wasn't until a doctor in Madison finally examined him and realized the illness was, quote, in his mind. But while Ralph is trapped in this medical nightmare fighting for his sanity, the social pressure doesn't stop.
Not at all.
Helen's mother, Nana, gives Ralph a brutal ultimatum while he is desperately sick. She tells him, either marry her or get out.
The pragmatism of the era returns. An engagement was a contract. An illness didn't void the contract in the eyes of Helen's family.
So he marries her. But I have to ask, what kind of person willingly steps into a marriage with a man who is actively screaming in the hallways of an isolation hospital?
You really have to look at what Helen was surviving.
Right, because she was carrying a parallel nightmare to the altar.
Oh, absolutely. Helen's childhood is a masterclass in parentification and stolen innocence. She was born in Italy in 1920, originally named Raffaella. Her father had left for the United States to find work when her mother was just 2 months pregnant.
So she didn't even meet her father until she was 4 years old.
Right, and her mother was profoundly abusive. There's a horrific memory in the transcript where little Helen is playing near some water, simply looking at her own reflection.
Just being a kid.
Exactly. Her mother walks up behind her and beats her with a stick until the child's legs bleed, supposedly to teach her not to fall into the water.
Just unimaginable.
When Helen finally immigrates to the U.S. in 1929, the trauma shifts from domestic to societal. She doesn't speak English and is mercilessly bullied at Columbus School for her Italian name.
The xenophobia was just so intense then.
It was. A classmate actually threw a heavy stone at her head. To protect her from further violence, her father legally changed her name to Helen when she was just 9 years old.
But the mechanism that truly defines Helen's early life is how she's forced to become the adult of her household. Her mother suffered from epilepsy, but also severe, untreated psychiatric distress.
Yeah.
This all came to a boiling point when Helen's grandfather, Grandpa Spitzeri, falsely accused Helen's mother of cheating.
And the accusation triggered a total psychotic break.
Yeah.
Her mother drank a bottle of iodine in a suicide attempt and was subsequently committed to a psychiatric ward for 6 months.
This really highlights the intense gender dynamics of the era. While Ralph's trauma was rooted in external systemic forces, the economy, the farm labor, the industrial accidents, Helen's trauma was entirely internal and domestic.
Perfectly said. When her mother was institutionalized, 12-year-old Helen became the matriarch. She was forced to raise her younger siblings, do the family's laundry on a glass washboard, and manage the cooking.
Imagine handing the entire household budget and survival of multiple children to a middle schooler today.
It's unthinkable.
There is this one detail that perfectly captures the grim reality of her parentification. She's 12, she's trying to make a meal for the family, and she opens a box of pasta only to find it full of mouse turds. She goes to her father, disgusted, and says she doesn't want to cook it. And her father just looks at her and tells her to shake the turds out and cook it anyway.
It's pure, unadulterated survival mode.
She absorbed the absolute brunt of her mother's mental illness and the incredibly rigid constraints placed on young women at the time.
So when Ralph and Helen marry in 1938, you have two people whose circuit breakers have been repeatedly tripped, coming together to build a life.
But the environment around them doesn't magically soften just because they found each other.
No, the industrial and medical horrors keep coming. Ralph manages to get a job at the Johns Manville plant, making $19 a week.
Doing what?
His job is to sift raw asbestos coloring into a machine.
Oh, no.
Now, there are no modern ventilation systems. He's issued protective goggles and a mask, but the physical labor is so intense that his sweat causes the goggles to fog up completely.
And if he can't see the machine, he can't do the work. If he can't do the work, he loses the job.
Exactly. So he makes a calculated, terrifying choice. He takes off his protective mask so he can wipe his goggles and see what he's doing.
Literally breathing in deadly raw asbestos dust day after day just to keep a paycheck coming in.
He trades long-term occupational hazard for short-term starvation prevention.
And Helen's physical endurance is equally tested. Right after giving birth to their son Vince in 1940, she develops severe kidney stones. The rudimentary surgery and the ensuing infection cause her weight to plummet to 90 pounds.
She is so weakened that Ralph literally has to carry her up the steps to their apartment.
But the story that truly stopped me in my tracks, and I think this is where you'll really feel the disconnect between today and the 1930s, is the nightmare they went through feeding their second child, Vicky.
Oh, this part is so hard to read.
Vicky was born with a highly sensitive throat and a hyperactive gag reflex. She physically could not swallow food or milk without throwing up. Today, if your infant can't eat, you're immediately referred to a pediatric specialist, a gastroenterologist, a speech-language pathologist. What was the medical protocol for a starving infant back then?
Brutal compliance. A local nurse instructed Helen to take a bottle, cut a massive hole in the rubber nipple, and literally slap the baby while squeezing the milk into her mouth.
Just horrifying.
The logic was that the physical shock of the slap would force the infant's throat muscles to instinctively swallow the liquid.
Helen writes about being absolutely terrified she was going to choke her own daughter to death, but the medical establishment insisted it was the only way to keep the child hydrated.
And it gets worse.
When Vicky is 2 years old and still refusing solid food, doctors in Madison gave Helen the official medical advice to completely medically, quote, starve the toddler until her survival instinct overrode her gag reflex.
And Helen followed the doctor's orders. She withheld food entirely until Easter Sunday, when the desperate 2-year-old finally picked up a piece of chewed-up spaghetti and managed to force it down.
Wow.
What we have to grasp here is that Ralph and Helen didn't have the luxury of researching gentle parenting methods or seeking second opinions.
Right.
Their authority figures gave them violent solutions to biological problems, and their only goal was keeping their children breathing for one more day.
It is staggering what they endured. Which brings us to how Ralph viewed his own life when he sat down to record these transcripts as an older man in 1994.
It's very reflective.
Yeah, reading his self-reflection, he doesn't paint himself as some flawless, stoic hero of the greatest generation. He's incredibly vulnerable. He admits that his nervous breakdown and his lingering anxiety made him far too strict as a father.
There's a heartbreaking note where he talks about refusing to let his son, Vince, go on a simple fishing trip.
Right, because Ralph was consumed by this completely irrational, paralyzing terror that the boy would drown.
He recognizes the long shadow his trauma cast over his family. He talks explicitly about his lingering, quote, insecureness.
Yeah.
He expresses this deep, melancholy wish that he could have been a more happy-go-lucky person.
Ugh.
But he acknowledges that he spent his entire life with his nose constantly to the grindstone.
He couldn't relax or enjoy the fruits of his labor because the fear of poverty, starvation, and ruin was permanently etched into the architecture of his brain.
So, synthesizing all of this, the mule rides, the asbestos, the baby food, the parentification, what is the ultimate insight we take away from the Belotti transcripts?
Yeah, what's the big picture here?
The insight is that trauma doesn't cleanly resolve just because you survive it. It shapes how you parent, how you love, and how you perceive safety. But simultaneously, surviving that trauma can build an indestructible foundation for the next generation.
That's a beautiful way to look at it.
Ralph and Helen endured poverty, the depression, profound psychosomatic illness, and medical barbarism. Yet they stayed together, they built a stable home, and they left a lasting legacy. Their survival wasn't elegant or romantic, but it was enduring.
It really forces you to reevaluate your own baseline of stress, doesn't it? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. There is so much immense value in reading these raw, unfiltered personal histories. They force us to confront the reality beneath the myths we casually accept.
They absolutely do. The gritty truth is always more compelling than the sepia photograph.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over today. We started by contrasting that crisp, smiling myth of the American dream with the terrifying reality of early 20th century survival. But when you look closely at the untreated psychological and physical burdens our ancestors carried every single day while successfully building entire lives and lineages, what does that say about the true hidden capacity of the human mind? Are we inherently biologically stronger than we think we are, or are we just carrying different invisible weights today? Keep diving deep, and we'll see you next time.